What's going on, guys? Isaiah here with YuGiOh Gaming, and I have Logan here with me, and we're going to do a tier list on what we believe the strongest decks are going into the format post Albaz structure deck. Now, this is without a ban list. If we do get a ban list before then, we'll definitely do a post ban list discussion. But for now, this is how we think the meta is going to start out once the structure deck drops at the end of this week. Also, real quick, we're almost at 600 subs, like 20 away. If you don't care, go ahead and drop a sub, like the video. Let's go. All right, guys. So getting into our tier list for the post Albaz structure deck, like I said, I have Logan here with me. We're just going to start out with DDD. I think this deck's pretty cool. I don't think it's as good as a lot of people think it is. Like, yeah, you can play a lot of hand traps, but this deck is, in my opinion, very fragile. I think it's just a tier 2 deck. Like, it can secure some wins, but if you get hit with multiple hand traps, you're just not really doing a whole lot.
Yeah, I think the deck's pretty okay. I think pretty much any of these decks you can probably top a tournament with that's on this list for the most part, but I definitely think this deck is definitely on the lower end of the spectrum, especially after like more decks get entered with the Fallen Albaz structure deck. Like, and if you've seen at the YCS, none of these decks top. Like, I just don't think it's a good metagame for it, especially with all the hand traps.
And our second on this is PK. What do you think about Phantom Knights going into the new format?
I think Phantom Knights are good, but Phantom Knights are definitely getting hit because of how many people are actually playing hand traps. I think the deck's better than DDD, but I wouldn't put it in tier 1. It's definitely probably like a tier 1.5 deck. If people start, lowering Nibiru and stuff because of Despia, because that card's not very good against Despia, then, I could definitely see Phantom Knights starting to rise up a little bit.
I agree. There's a lot of people don't know why this deck's falling off, and it's just because of hand traps. Like, everyone's got 2 hand traps in their hand, and PK, if used correctly, PK can't really play through it. But the deck is still very powerful. And then after the structure deck, obviously Despia is going to get a really big boost, and I really think this deck is going to be tier 1, if not one of the best 3 decks in the game.
I agree. With the little playtesting that I have with the deck, a lot of the hand traps that we're currently playing right now actually don't do very much against Despia. Valor and Imperm aren't very good cards. Ogre's okay-ish. Like it's okay against like Fateful, but like they don't rely on Fateful. Ash is super powerful, but with everyone playing 60 card decks, your chances of seeing Ash is really low. Um, and it also has just like a good matchup across the board, and it can play like super poly main deck. It uses Gamma very well. The deck's just super solid. It's just a super good mid range deck, and it like just has good matchups across the board. I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think the deck is insane. I think a lot of people are trying to do too much of the deck, and that I've seen people testing it. I think the deck is just going to be very good. I don't think it's going to be the boss house that everyone thinks it's going to be and just dominate everything, but it's definitely going to be something a lot of people are playing and a lot of people are going to be doing well with.
I definitely think it's going to shake up the metagame just because like a lot of the going second cards that people are playing right now just do nothing against the deck, and that's going to have to change.
Next on our list, we have my boy Dotscaper, or Sideburst decks. I think these decks are cool. I think they're really strong. I don't know how strong I feel. I feel like they're not as going to be as good as the Despia deck, but they're not as low as PK going into the new format.
Yeah, they're definitely better than PK in my opinion. If they are tier 1, I think they're at the bottom of tier 1. But the deck's definitely strong. Um, the deck just uses DP very well. It abuses the Charmers very well. I think the better version of this deck is probably like Jesse's Red Rose list. But this deck is very cool. This deck's very good.
Then we have Dragon Link. Dragon Link, I feel like is the same thing in this format as it was last time. It's not terrible, but it does theoretically the same thing that the other like Red Rose decks do, but without having to play as many bricks. And it's not as consistent as the other deck. But the deck still does a lot. It still has Heretic, the seal, and your cards are just really good by themselves.
Yeah, and it can play a high number of hand traps, which is really good. Dragons are always going to be in the meta unless like the format just gets too powerful.
Then we have Eldritch. This is Trap Eldritch, and obviously it did really well at the YCS this past weekend. I don't really know how this is going to work going into the new format with the Albaz structure deck. How is the matchup with Despia and Trap Eldritch?
I've never played that matchup nor seen it played. I honestly have no clue. I would imagine that it's just fine. I wouldn't imagine that it's like favored either way, because a lot of the floodgates just don't do very much against Despia. Even like you can dodge like stuff like skill drain and stuff, so like that's not that big of a deal. So I would imagine that it is favored for Despia, but at the same time, a well-timed skill drain and just floodgating your opponent, it does happen, So yeah, I think it's probably about a 50-50 matchup. I wouldn't say either one's favored.
How do you feel about Fluunderies going into the new format?
I definitely think the deck falls off some. Uh, the matchup against Despia isn't great. It's not bad, but one of your best cards is a D shifter doesn't do a whole lot. Um, because the Despia monsters don't actually care about going to grave. Um, and yeah, like the deck's still going to be one of the best decks. Because of how good it is against prank kids and the needle fiber decks and stuff. I think the deck's going to fall off a little bit, but I definitely still think it's going to be one of the best decks. It's still going to be tier one probably
Another thing with
or
Despia
tier
is
one.
you can just summon your fusions in defense, and they do the same thing. Like
Exactly.
Impin's
Right.
not insanely good against it.
Yeah, Impin's definitely worse against that deck, but Rise is actually really good against Despia. Um, so it's weird. It's like your best monster is bad against the deck, but like your second best monster is like really good against the deck, but your best hand traps, bad. So
And Sword Soul, I think is a really strong deck. I don't think it really changes much. I think it's still going to be, between 1 and 2. Just consistent deck, does more or less the same thing. And on multiple negates, consistently break your boards with 10 Ys. I think it's just a really good, okay deck.
I agree. I think Sword Soul is just good. It's very good in long drawn out tournaments. Also, just good when starting a new format because it's just like a reliable deck, right? It does the same thing every single game. When people are trying to do wild stuff and trying to like innovate a lot, and they don't have like super well built cohesive strategies, they can just take advantage of that.
Prank Kids, I still think is one of the best decks, if not the best deck. Still, I think the deck is just super strong, as we saw in the YCS this past weekend. It's took the whole YCS, had the most decks played. I just think this deck is insane. So if the ban list doesn't come and change anything with the deck, I don't think it's really going to move after the structure deck.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think Despia has a pretty good matchup against Prank Kids. But at the same time, it's hard to like imagine Prank Kids not being good. Like just the fact that double Butler pop is still really powerful. Um, and even if you get multiple hand traps, you still end on DPE plus Brave. Like the deck's just super solid. It's still going to be in the top three decks. The deck's just super good.
Then we have Plunder. A lot of people were playing Plunder at the YCS this weekend, saying they had a really good matchup against Praying Kids, but I don't think it really does. I mean, it's got an okay matchup. I just think this deck, if your opponent doesn't play, you don't really do a whole lot. So I think the deck's still going to be a tier 2 deck. I don't think it's going to change at all after the structure deck.
Yeah, I played against a Plunder player. And he seemed like a pretty solid player. I don't know all the ins and outs of the the Plunder Patrol deck, but I do know like he seemed like a decent enough player that he knew like his deck. Um, and I realized that if you're playing Prank Kids and you just don't put Lampsies in Graveyard, they actually have a really, really hard time actually just like doing anything to disrupt you. If you just keep everything Earth, Water, Wind, they just can't do anything.
Then we have our Red Rose decks. This is going to be, your base, the Red Rose Dino deck that people have been playing, and everything that just maximizes on this. I still think it's going to be tier 1. I don't think it's going to move anywhere. It's still a very, very strong deck.
Yeah, this can be the Tinny Brave deck. This can or like the Tinny Red Rose Brave deck. This can be um Jesse's deck where he plays Prosperities and plays Fusion Destiny. This can be the base deck. I think all those decks are really reasonable. I do like Jesse's deck a lot. It seems very consistent, and I think all those decks are just really good.
I think the same thing with 3 Axis. 3 Axis is just kind of like the same thing as the base deck. You're just playing a bunch of ways to get to like Cherubini to get your engine started. I don't think it's as good as the Red Rose decks, but I would say it's definitely like right there.
Yeah, I agree.
And then we have Dogmatica. This could be Shaddoll Dogmatica, it could be Invoke Dogmatica, just Dogmatica decks. I think they're pretty cool. I think a lot of them, or a few of them, squeezed into the YCS top 32. I think this deck has, I would say, a surprise factor because people expect it to be there, but it's not something you see as often. And some people just, it's hard to play through Punishment Fleer and a Winda or a Mechaba, and some people just can't do that.
Yeah, and prank kids actually struggle with Mechaba quite a bit if they don't have access to the Brave package at all. So
We have Tri-Brigade. Uh, Tri-Brigade does get a boost after the structure deck, but I don't know if it'll be enough to push them over like the consistent tier 2 contender it is.
I honestly think the deck I disagree. I think the deck gets a lot better. Like I honestly think it's gonna be as good as like a Sword Soul deck. Um, I think it's probably gonna be better than Dragons. I think just the fact that all the Despia stuff works so well with your engine and allows you to get follow up. You know, Revolt's still a super powerful card, especially against like prank kids. Like prank kids actually struggle a lot with Omen. If you can just summon an Omen every turn, it's kind of hard for them to grind. You can out DPE very easily because of Omen and Double Dragon Lords. So the deck seems very well positioned. On top of that, being able to play all the hand traps, and then the Ice Jade Dragon's just broken, right? And especially in the Tri Brigade version, you can make there's a combo where you can make it where they can't target it. So it's it's like even harder to out. I think the deck's super solid. Um, and I think it's definitely better than like some of the other decks in Tier 1.5, to be honest.
I'm excited to see it. I like watching this deck play. It's not like anything insane, but I think, like you were saying, like with the new stuff, I think it's going to be a whole new orientation of the deck or whatever. Then we have Striker. Some interesting Striker lists and did well at the YCS this past weekend. I don't think the deck changes at all with the new structure deck, but I do think this deck is still pretty okay. Would you say tier 2 or tier 1.5?
I think the deck's Tier 2. Um, but I also think the deck can top like any tournament. It's just all your cards are just so good. It's probably the top of Tier 2, to be honest. Um, it's definitely better than these other two decks, I think. But the thing is, like, if you get the metagame wrong with Sky Striker, like you get it wrong. You know what I mean? It's one of those decks that like rewards you for being able to call the metagame and playing the right cards. Like sometimes Shark Cannon's a very powerful card, and sometimes it's just awful, right? And sometimes Attributter's good, and sometimes it's bad. And if you just hit the nail on the head and play the right tech cards, Striker could be one of the best decks, but it could also be one of the worst decks depending on your card choices.
Yeah, it definitely depends on the decks that you think you're going to play against and the decks you actually play against. All right, so this is our list, but we're going to go a little deeper and say what we think is going to be the best decks in order or kind of close to it. I think in tier 1, I still think Prank Kids is probably the best deck, followed by, I think Despia is probably going to be the second best deck, and then the Red Rose deck, followed by, I think 3X is the bottom, and the Cybers deck is just right there in between it.
Yeah, I agree. I think Prankins just has all the right tools that you need. If you notice, all these decks can play Brave, all these decks can play DPE, and they all do it really well. Um, and I think that Despia is a nice addition to the metagame, but it's like that. It's sort of like the control deck, but it's not really a control. It's weird. It's like a mid-range control deck. Um, but I really wouldn't classify it as like a you know like a control deck. It's just a weird deck in general, and I think it's well positioned, but I don't think it's like better than Prank Kids by any means. And in tier 1.5, I think at the top of tier 1.5 we have Flunderies. I think the deck, beats most of the top decks with one card, which is D Shifter. D Shifter super powerful, as well as Barrier Statue and just what Flunderies does. Sometimes this deck's unbeatable, and sometimes the deck literally can't win. Just depends on how you draw. So a deck like that's really scary. After that, I think we have Sword Soul. I think Sword Soul is just a super consistent deck. Baxia is really good. All the teeny monsters are super solid. And especially if you master this deck, if you notice a lot of players who did well with the deck, is just people who have been playing Sword Soul, like Charlie, Dominic Couch, all of them. We're all playing Sword Soul just because they haven't played Sword Soul forever and they just knew all the ins and outs of Sword Soul and it was just really good. Then, in my opinion, I think Tri Brigade is the next deck. I know this seems weird because, like, after the YC has no Trevor Gate stop, but this deck does just get revamped after the structure deck, and I think it just becomes one of the better decks. It's very similar to Sword Soul, I think, in the play style, and with people not playing Lancia and stuff, it definitely makes the deck better. And then after that, I would say Dragon Link is probably the next. Then PK, then Eldritch, then Invoke, or the Dogmatica decks. And then I'd keep tier 2 the same. Really wouldn't change anything there.
All right, guys, so that is our take on what we believe is going to be the best decks going into the format with the Albaz structure deck. Again, if the ban list comes between now and then, we'll definitely release an updated list. So make sure you guys subscribe and like, and make sure you guys keep your eye out with the notification bell so you'll see that video. We definitely want to help you guys when you're entering all these tournaments now that IRL play is back. We want to make sure you guys have the best meta calls for your deck. Make sure you want to have the best ideas for your decks. Just make sure that you're prepared as much as possible to dominate your metagame. But like I said, make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.